I wanted to give a, hey, it's so great to be back sermon. And it is. I am glad to be back. But as Elizabeth pointed out, this is kind of a terrible gospel for this week. It's kind of a terrible gospel because Jesus leaves. And right now, the last thing I think any of us feel like we need is Jesus leaving. And honestly, I find the disciples' response to be equally frustrating. Jesus leaves, and they go and are joyful. How dare they? They go, and not only are they no longer hidden away in that upper room where they went after the crucifixion and stayed even after Jesus showed up to them. They're no longer back at their jobs, casting their nets widely. They're in the temple. They are back among their fellow Jewish believers, celebrating and blessing God. Because Jesus just blessed them. And then Jesus left. Sometimes I think some of our worst Christian theology comes out of this moment. So many images of Jesus on a cloud floating away. And not only is Jesus on the cloud floating away, but we imagine that that's our future too, right? How many times have you seen the bumper sticker, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned? When I was in Southern California, I saw it all the time. This idea that when God comes and brings us and our humanity into God, that actually what's going to happen is that we are taken away from everything that makes us human, and we get to float away on some cloud. Now we're in the midst of these three amazing feast days: Ascension, Pentecost, and Trinity Sunday. And they go together beautifully. And so next week, we get to celebrate and talk about the one who comes. But right now, Jesus, in Jesus' body, leaves. And so often we interpret that as kind of God leaving and taking us away from everything around us, right? And right now, I think in some ways that's what we would like. We would like to escape a world where we just fundamentally believe that we can't change it, that nothing's going to change. Spent a lot of time reading the opinion column in the New York Times over the last week, and honestly, it's more hopeless than I've ever seen it. Because every single columnist basically says nothing is going to change. Thoughts and prayers, and we will pray for those who have died today. Thoughts and prayers aren't actually going to change our culture, which is obsessed with violence as a legitimate answer, violence as a legitimate way of responding to anything around us, whether it's conflicts far away or any threat to the castle that is our home. I have no words to make that go away. I don't have any words to offer comfort in that. What I can say is that when Jesus ascends to God, when Jesus goes away, it is not God separating Jesus and God's self from all those things that make us human, including the fear and the anger and the grief that we experience. It is God scooping up our humanity, scooping up the flesh and the blood and the wounds and the grief and the anguish and the crucified body of Jesus. Remember, the body of Jesus that goes to God is one that bears the marks of crucifixion. It is God taking everything that makes us human, all of the things that we are, and bringing those things into God. It is not a separation of this kind of earthly suffering and the kind of grief and the loss that we experience. It is the bringing of that into God. I'm not sure that it makes us feel better. I'm not sure that it's going to radically change everything. As a matter of fact, I know it's not, because it hasn't yet. Because a part of God bringing our humanity into God's very self is the acknowledgement that the freedom that we have to love one another and to hurt one another will be honored by God. God isn't going to make us change. God isn't going to snap God's fingers and make the world a better place. God enters into our humanity, suffers a horrible and violent and bloody death, much like those in Buffalo and those in Uvalde suffered. A death at the hands of injustice, a death at the hands of hate and anger and loneliness and fear, all of those things that make us turn against one another. God entered into those, and then God brings those into God's very self. It doesn't fix it. It doesn't make it go away. At some level, that's up to us. Because by bringing our humanity into God, what God is saying is that our humanity and how we live it out matters to one another. It matters the choices that we make. It matters the way we live as a community. It matters the way that we welcome people or don't welcome people. The invitation of Revelation is that everyone who is thirsty, come and drink, because there is enough of God to go around. As we cast our nets widely, and as we follow Father Bob's recommendation that we cast those nets to those who have never heard of God, never been to church, what would it be like if everybody understood themselves as deeply beloved by God? What would it be like if we actually felt that way in our gut of guts? That is the invitation that God gives through us. Come, everybody who is thirsty, come and drink. There is enough of God to go around, and every experience we have, the joy and the grief, the anger and the despair and the hopelessness, all of those, God brings in to God's self. So wherever you're at right now, know that God has brought that into God. That your grief is God's grief, that your joy is God's joy. Your need to take a break, also God's need to take a break. All of those are in God. All of those are taken up, not as a way of escaping on a cloud elsewhere, but as a reminder that all of our humanity is contained in God. It is welcome. It is loved. it is cherished, it is held. And maybe we can respond to that by gathering in joy and celebrating. And maybe we can't. Maybe some people just couldn't make it to church today because they were just too sad, too much, too heavy. Maybe some of you who did come to church today don't actually feel like celebrating. And that is okay. Because the reality is, all of who we are is taken up into God. It is held by God. It is known by God. And it is loved